I'm delighted to see you all, and I'm actually thrilled that digital preservation would bring so many people inside on such a nice day. It's very promising. I must say that I'm quite honored to be here in this lecture series because following the two previous, Jim Marley and Helen Shenton, who have made such significant contributions to the profession, I want to just make clear that I don't see myself in that same role, rather as someone who sort of walks the border between people who use preserved information and people who actually preserve the information. So I'm delighted to be here in that capacity. I will not speak about preservation today from a professional perspective because I am, after all, a historian, not a preservationist, as Bobby said. Nor will I speak necessarily from a personal point of view, although I want to make clear that all the views that I express are actually strictly my own and not those of any organization with which I have worked. I also want to say that I am going to speak in a very strong voice. I'm not going to be very nuanced about what I say, so I imagine that this will spark a number of questions, but I want to just sweep away some of the cobwebs in terms of general understandings of preservation and of the specific role that digital preservation plays in our culture today. Because that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about preservation from a social perspective. The role of preservation in culture, and particularly our culture at this moment, which I've characterized as the age of abundance of information. It's a period of information profligacy, and I think actual promiscuity. But it doesn't mean that we have any more attention span. In fact, the challenge is that we have more information and the same finite amount of attention. And I think this goes very much to the thing that I want to talk about most, and that is the need to shape and select the historical record in a way that we have not done in analog preservation. Not that we haven't done it, but we've done it in a very different way. So I want to focus on the social context of digital preservation, preservation of born digital materials. Most of all, I want to talk about the value of preservation for society, and so I will actually talk about the economics of information. I don't want you to be worried. I'm not an economist either, and I'm not going to talk economies, but I have worked with economists on this issue, and they have a lot to tell us about value and how societies decide to commit resources to one thing and not to another. What I say will apply in part to analog materials that have been converted to digital, but I really want to address the challenge of born digital because it is the particular challenge that has been given to us in this generation. Whether we like it or not and whether we trained for this is actually our challenge now. And it's something that we need to take very seriously because the clock is ticking on a whole variety of fronts, and it's not just the content that we need to be preserving. It's the professional skills that we need to develop in order to deal with a very changing environment of information and changing value of information. And by economics, I'm not going to talk about cost models or business models or anything having to do with capitalism or the free market. I mean simply that the allocation of resources, which are always scarce, to some things and not to another. So how is it that we decide to put money here? Because it's always at the expense of something else, or so we think. And so how do we actually make those decisions? It's about judgments, and it's about our sense of value. Because everything that has value costs something: people, time, and yes, money. So where does preservation fit into the list of things that our society deems most important, if not essential? In other words, as I sometimes wonder, does anybody out there really get it, how important preservation is? And the answer to that question is yes, definitely. They definitely do. People definitely get the value of preservation in society. They have a special name for it. They call it access. I think the problem from the preservationist's point of view is that what they don't get is that there's a relationship between preservation and access, that without preservation, there can be no access. And I think that there's a way that we in the preservation community and people who care about the historical record can, if not make them care about preservation, for the process itself, can make them care very much about the outcomes of preservation and therefore support preservation as it should be. I mean, this lack of identification between access and preservation is acute in the digital realm, partly because digital content is not very long-lived. And I mean that in many sense. There hasn't been information or digital information for long, and it certainly doesn't last that long. But the failure, I think, goes far deeper than this sort of, what me worry storage is cheap, Alfred E. Newman's school of preservation, which I've heard an astounding number of technologists say, technologists who really should know better because they've lost data. So I want to say just a word about the idea of cheap storage, and this is a very serious point. Storage requires energy. I mean, we're not just talking about digital storage, we're talking about all forms of storage, as you know. The use of power will never, ever be cheap. I remember the days, I miss the days actually, when experts would say that, energy is actually not going to be a problem because of nuclear power. That in fact, nuclear power will be so cheap that we will stop metering it. And I think that we are now living through an absolutely horrifying catastrophe that shows just how expensive not only energy is, and nuclear power in particular, but how incredibly dependent we are on the power grid in ways that we can hardly calculate. I'm not saying that we should go back to paper, but I am saying that we need to attend to the entire spectrum of issues that are related to digital storage and the digital life cycle. It goes far beyond servers. It goes beyond the power grid itself. So the message about preservation needs to be heard at the very highest levels. It needs to be seen as critical infrastructure, which of course it is. I think more to the point, it's cheap so we can store everything misses the single most important point, which is not everything is equally valuable. It avoids the very tough question of selection, which I think is absolutely critical and even more so in an age of abundance. And I know this is very controversial in some areas and even in special collections where people feel that selection is a way of limiting and biasing the historical record, that it's difficult and it is by definition prejudicial. And I say, yes, it is, but we have no choice. In fact, selection and collection building has always been culturally inflected. It has always reflected the cultural biases of the people who create information and the people who are successive stewards of that. And I have to say, as a historian, I got that. I understood that the historical record was not absolutely reflective of everything. That's why I went to school, to learn how to use resources and to have them tell me what I wanted to hear rather than just rely on the things that were there. And furthermore, it makes me believe that no matter what we leave to some extent, the skill of interpretation lies with the interpreter. But we need to give them the best possible perspective, the best possible choice. I will say also that having studied for a long time in the USSR, I don't believe that information wants to be free. I actually think the historical record is extremely important to be conscious stewards of, because information is very easy to use and to manipulate for whatever purposes you want, good or ill. Just one final word of introduction, and those are my priors, before we start talking about the good news about digital preservation as well as some of the cautions. And that is what I know is both as an historian and because of the people that I have worked with. I've spent many years working in the Library of Congress and working with the Library of Congress and in many other places in which I've just sponged up as much information as I could. And I think the thing that I learned most importantly was what I saw the audiovisual preservationists grapple with at the Library of Congress. That audiovisual, you're already dealing with an historical record which is extremely fragile, which is already discounted historically as not significant, although we find out too late that it is significant. And also how to deal with things which are dynamic, that is, that are dynamic in time. Because I think this is another challenge in digital preservation, is a mindset that preservation is about fixing things once and for all. Having the right standards, fixing the right version. This is simply not going to be the case in digital preservation. So I think for those who are shy about getting into digital preservation, at least make friends in audio, with people in audio-visual preservation, because they have a lot of this in their DNA, how to actually look at this kind of material and assess its value. So I want to start with the good news about digital preservation, because there has been an enormous amount of good news, and it is mostly good news. It's amazing to think how far we've gotten in just 15 years roughly. First, in terms of awareness, the fact is that there are a lot of people who are aware of the need for digital preservation now. You could say that everyone who's experienced some loss of data or having to upgrade data understands that. There are a huge number of technical advances, and I won't list them all because there are so many. But in terms of preservation, improved bit storage, including the move to the cloud, which I think is going to give us some kind of scale that we have longed for. Also, better understanding of file formats, and there has been enormous amount of work done in preservation metadata, really spectacular work in preservation metadata. We are also seeing on the landscape increased institutional commitments to digital preservation, and I think that from our perspective in this library, that's the most significant. We've seen national libraries taking responsibility for some domain. We see movie studios seriously investing in digital preservation. Financial companies have been doing this for a long time, and there are a lot of data archives. You know, it's not as if we have to invent digital preservation for ourselves in the library world. Most everything that we want to know and use has been done already and forged for us in another sector. Some institutions have even sprung up just to deal with preserving the cultural heritage. I say some, but in fact I have in mind one, which is the Internet Archive. The Internet Archive that started in 1996 with a typical sort of no bounds, I want everything approach, and has been simply doing and learning. It's an iterative approach that its founder, Brewster Kahle, knows from the tech world. You got a problem, you try a solution. That doesn't work, you try it again. You never wait for version 3.0 because then it's too late. And I think that that's very hard for some library staff to understand, library professionals to understand, coming from at least a paper-based world. I think also the other thing that's important is on the issue of scale, we've seen several models of shared stewardship emerge. I think everybody who knows the least bit about digital technology knows that preserving data can't be done in the old-fashioned library way of, you know, one library, one campus, and siloed collections. In fact, there has to be a scaled effort to build at least the infrastructure for digital preservation. This has been forged by the National Science Foundation when they put together the Office of Cyber Infrastructure, in which they felt that all of their extremely well-funded science directorates still could not tackle preservation on their own, or the building of the infrastructure. It had to be done at scale, which meant across institutions and disciplinary lines. I want to touch briefly on some bad news, which is essentially all of the above. Everything that I said has some downside to it, not surprisingly. So in the area of technical advances, we've made enormous strides in preservation advances, but we have not kept pace with the technical advances in the creation of information. In fact, we're falling very far behind. There's not much we can do about that, but that is the case, that the ability to create data will always outstrip our ability to preserve it. And we have already technically far exceeded, the amount of information there is, has far exceeded the storage capacity worldwide. And this is just of scientific data. So even those people who are power users are beginning to understand that they can't save everything. I want to say about awareness, I think there is a great deal of awareness in the cultural heritage institutions about the need for digital preservation. But we see a lot of institutions saying, but that doesn't mean me. That doesn't mean me because I don't have the capacity. I don't have the funding, I don't have the expertise. I think the saddest cases in my mind are historical societies and smaller regional libraries, and then the major metropolitan public libraries, which have a very valuable role in collecting regional history, not just serving the public bestsellers. And I think that they're really bereft. They're really left on their own in this world. And so that's why I think the idea of shared stewardship is even more important, to build a robust infrastructure that small institutions can use almost as a kind of service bureau. And I think the preservation world has really modeled this extremely well in the field services that they provide, and some of the service bureaus that they have for preservation that serve very small constituents. After all, we know that local history and the micro is very important. Now I want to speak slightly against grain here and talk about the bad news in terms of institutional commitments, because I talked about national libraries, financial companies, movie studios. I want to know where the ARL libraries are in this. And I'm not talking about converted materials when they've done a spectacular job of converting their materials for access purposes, nor am I talking about the extensive work that has been done in negotiating access to scholarly literature, which is born digital, access which has a preservation back end in many cases. There's a kind of if you go out of business, we get to keep this. I'm talking about the born digital material that the humanists of the future will be using, not scholarly literature, but the primary sources of our culture. I think to a surprising degree, I think research libraries whose specialty actually is that have been really missing in action. And I think that there's a significant risk that, that this will go on for some time if libraries don't just step in and try to do it and do just a little bit. You don't have to do much. But work with your special collections area. You know what your collecting strengths are. Just go out and do some web archiving. Or something else, partner with people who are digital creators, because there's a lot of opportunity there for your feet to get wet in a kind of no-fault area. I think that from an economic point of view, there might be very compelling reasons why research libraries are among the last to enter into this space. Not among the last, but certainly laggards, I'd say, considering the importance of these institutions. And it is, as I learned from economists on the Blue Ribbon Task Force, it's an economic reason. It's because, to some extent, libraries have lost their incentive to preserve. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, because why would a library need an incentive if, in fact, it's their mission to preserve? But I think that sometimes missions are lip service, and that you can have a mission that you're not able to fulfill, and it still means a great deal to you, but it's not something which is actionable that you will actually dedicate a lot of money to. And I think preservation is at risk of becoming this in the digital world. I think the incentive for libraries to preserve analog collections has been access. You could not serve readers without providing a book for them. And you could not serve this faculty without having books that dated from 1850 or before. It was simply something that you had to do. Libraries weren't founded around preservation. They were founded around access, and preservation was built as a back end to support access that people wanted. You know, the country has been very slow at a policy level to move in step with the digital realm. The copyright law, despite recommendations for tiny incremental changes to Section 108 to allow copying of digital materials for libraries, that law has not, the law has not been amended. Our Congress seems to be quite distracted by a number of other things. I'd say in the meantime, the good news is, in the meantime, copyright law has become quite irrelevant to a large number of people who are creating data. And I think that gives us a real opportunity. I don't think that as long as materials are licensed and we deal with the licensing regime as opposed to the copyright law, we're going to be doing significantly differently than we are now, and I think we've made considerable strides in that area. But there's a lot of, even in the area of scholarly literature, there's an increasing amount of scholarship which is written outside of journals, which is very important. There are lots of scholarly blogs in certain fields which are quite preservation worthy and are looking for homes for preservation. I want to talk also about the good news of shared stewardship models, because in fact, I mean, I talked about the shared stewardship model as a good thing, and it is. Actually, there have been a large number, say NDIP is one program, and LOCKS is another, and HathiTrust is yet a third. But particularly when it comes to universities, there's a downside to that, which is sharing is not easy. And the universities are, particularly the ones that have the richest collections, they're in a very competitive stance one with another. They compete for students, they compete for faculty, they compete for collections, they compete at sports. And I think that this is very much out of step with what's needed in the digital world. I do believe that, in fact, there are universities talking about building shared preservation infrastructure, because I've encountered already that this is not something that they can do except collectively. I would say LOCKS is an example of that, HathiTrust is an example of that. But I think it's a very serious issue which needs to be addressed in the next couple of years, and I expect Yale will be part of the solution for that and be eager to join. I mean, even Harvard has announced that it's willing to join in some aspects of sharing collections and preservation. So I would say there's a fairly good example up in the Brick campus up north. I want to spend the rest of my time here talking specifically about some of the findings from the Blue Ribbon Task Force on Sustainable Digital Preservation and Access. It's in part because I think this is work that tends to be, that hasn't gotten a lot of traction because it looks like it's about economics. And I think that scares a lot of people away. But I think it's actually a salubrious way of looking at the challenges of building support for preservation. Because in the end, preservation has to pay its way. It doesn't have to pay its way financially, but it has to be something that society says it is willing to invest in as opposed to something else. And I think we can make a very good case for that. Several years ago, the National Science Foundation and the Library of Congress got together to wanted to get preservationists and economists, academic economists, real economists, to talk about the fundamental economics of digital sustainability. Why? Because digital preservation had been dealt with as a technical problem, and as a legal problem, and as a collecting problem, but never seriously as an economic problem. And I'll say economists do not think of what they do as business models and cost models. That's actually what people in business school do, as they told me on the task force. They actually look at society's engagement with the commitment of resources to things that they care about. So we looked at it from a global perspective. We worked for 2 years, and we produced 2 reports. The first report was purely descriptive. It just looked at the world and said, what have we done? What solutions are there for digital preservation and paying for it? And what lessons have been learned? What are the things that people have tried that have not succeeded that we should not try? The second year was what we call normative, looking at where we're going, or actually in this case, looking at where we wanted to go, and then plotting a course for how we would get there from here. It did sometimes feel like that, like we were in Maine and the person would just say, well, we can't get there from here, But in fact, there is a way to engage all the sectors that we need in economic support of this activity, in some ways simply by recalibrating how we describe what we do and addressing a different audience than we have. The Economist did a very good job of characterizing preservation as an economic activity, and I won't give you their economies. It's incredibly funny and amusing to hear them describe preservation in economic terms. They have an array of technical terms which are really quite interesting and get at some very core concepts, but as the writer of the report, I found that they needed translation constantly. And so I will speak to you in translated economies and tell you that for digital preservation, we determined that there were 5 conditions for sustainability, and there are only 5 conditions. This is all incidentally in the report, and I will tell you how to find the report at the end of the talk. I'm not going to give you a URL. I will give you the title again so you can Google it. The URL is a little ungainly. So the 5 conditions for support are a recognition of the benefits of preservation by decision makers, and a decision maker is anybody who's in a position to commit a resource to something. Or to influence a decision, I should say. Who is a decision maker at Yale? Well, obviously the president is, the head of the library is, anybody who runs a budget is, but the faculty are also decision makers. They can set priorities for what's important on campus. But the important thing is to recognize the benefits of preservation. That is, what is it that stakeholders get out of preservation? Again, it's about the outcomes. The second thing that's needed is a process for selecting digital materials with long-term value. That's very, very difficult, and I think people found it the most difficult task. But there was absolutely no interest in anybody from the task force coming out and saying that we should be keeping everything because we can. It was very clear to the people who charged the task force that in fact presidents of universities, for example, would not invest in digital preservation if they thought it was a black hole and it would be collecting everything indiscriminately. They wanted a lot of work going into a selection, which I think is very smart. There have to be incentives. The third is there have to be incentives for decision makers to make the decision to preserve in the public interest. And I will talk a little bit about incentives because it seems like a sort of odd thing to talk about in preservation. And odd in terms of mission work. But in fact, incentives are key to actually getting things done. There needs to be, the fourth is there needs to be appropriate organization and governance of digital preservation activities. And I'll say that I'd be surprised if this campus were any different than any campus I've ever been on, where digital preservation happens in multiple places and nobody knows where they are. Nobody knows what other people are doing, and they don't even know about the duplication of effort that they're making. So it is really critical that there be a strategy for digital preservation, and that people know what the strategy is, and there be clear lines of responsibility for who does what. We heard from many government agencies that produce public records that are by law to be preserved. When somebody was ready to hand off a record, a digital record, for example, be he a scientist in a laboratory or somebody in immigration, they would turn to somebody and say, so where do I send this? And there was no answer. Nobody knew who was in charge. And so I think that it's quite essential that people be tasked specifically, and that, second, that everybody knows who is tasked specifically about who is in charge of what. It's the only way to actually implement the strategy, because it is, after all, we're dealing with ephemeral and distributed materials. It's not as if somebody can just put a whole bunch of books in a room and say, okay, let's take care of this. It has to be handled in a distributed way. The fifth challenge is the mechanisms for securing ongoing and efficient allocation of resources to digital preservation activities. Efficient doesn't mean cheap. It means that you get the biggest bang for your buck. So there's an appropriate amount of redundancy, but there's not unnecessary duplication. Not surprisingly, the things that people found the greatest challenge about meeting those conditions. I should say, incidentally, that the first year we spent looking for somebody who could claim that they had fulfilled all 5 of those conditions. And the closest we got was somebody who thought they were doing sort of 3, maybe 4. But then on closer examination, when we asked them questions, decided no, they weren't actually doing that many either. So it's complicated, and it's not as if there's a model out there that people can hand off to somebody else. Getting into conversation, I think, with other people who are doing digital preservation is possibly the first intelligent step. But almost in order of the challenges, I'll tell you what they were. The first was uncertainty about selection criteria, which I mentioned, for assessing long-term value. On the one hand, we had scientists talking about large-scale data sets. Some of them could say, well, we know that those petabytes of data from space will not be useful after 10 years because we'll have superseded the observational data with something else. On the other hand, there was a different set of astronomers who said, you know what, all astronomical data is historical data. We can't get rid of anything. So they were having a hard time sorting through that one, but they did realize they had to make a choice. So they were thinking about ways to sample historical data so that they could do it cheaply. We also found a great challenge were the small handcrafted digital collections, many of which abound on campuses, made by students and faculty members. And then the biggest one, which we decided we couldn't avoid, is the plethora of new genres that are emerging on the web mediated by social media and the so-called open web, things like Wikipedia and Twitter, things that we know are of enormous social significance. But what part of it is significant? How we collect it, how we save it, what are the copyright and ownership claims to it? Not a clue. Absolutely not a clue. I think it was on the basis of the complete gulf about how important it was versus knowing what to do about it that really prompted the Library of Congress to say, we're going to take the Twitter archive. We don't know what that means. We have no idea what that means. But Twitter doesn't either. And who better to find out with than Twitter? So, that's the kind of partnership where you can go into it with an expectation of failure, but it's a failure, but failures are learning experiences. If it's failure without a learning experience, then it is really a failure. But if you go into something knowing that the outcome actually is knowledge, not necessarily saving something, then you can get pretty far with trying out different methods for selection. And I can tell you my colleagues at the library that were absolutely gobsmacked when the first public reaction, besides some people saying, hey, that's great, were people individually trying to reach individuals in the Library of Congress saying, that Twitter, I want my Twitter back. You know, I didn't know that it was going to be preserved forever. I never knew that it was, you know, that anyone had a right to preserve it. And of course, it's all very clear on the Twitter when you click through that license that unless you make an exemption, you know, it is actually, it's not your private property anymore. And people publish this online, and it's totally accessible, but they're very sensitive about it being preserved. So you run into some very unexpected issues simply by trying things out. There's also another challenge which I'll get into. It's quite specific in every community, the scholarly community or scientific community or in Hollywood, for example. But there's a really fundamental misalignment of incentives to preserve. Copyright law is completely out of whack with what we need to be doing in terms of copyrighted materials. And the rewards in the academy for attending to digital preservation, where it matters the most, are also out of whack. And I will actually spend some time on talking about that. And then finally, I want to say that another thing that was really baffling, which I don't think we're ever going to solve, is trying to discriminate between preservation, the cost of making something accessible versus the cost of making something, preserving something. In fact, they're not separable. And so teasing out preservation costs as opposed to access costs is a fool's game. I think it's much better to think of long-term sustained data management, in which you look at every object as having a life cycle. And the life cycle can be 5 years, it can be 1 year, and it can be 50 years. But it's much more useful to think about life cycle costs and life cycle management of digital data. And it also makes it a whole lot easier to think about selection in this case. The really good news is we did find that once the risks were identified, and we recommended everybody doing an assessment of where they are with this, do a self-assessment of where they are based on some of the things in our report. We found that, in fact, for nearly everything that we thought of as a risk, there is a mitigation. There is actually a lot to be done in order to make the environment friendly for digital preservation. And the really good news, I think, is that it is everybody's problem. It's not, you know, it's not Yale's problem, and it's not my problem. It's actually everybody's problem. So when rumor first spread that the Library of Congress and NSF were looking to put together this task force on economics, we had a flood of people volunteering time and effort and money, and a lot of interest on the part of people in a university administration. Of course, they also thought that we would hand them a blueprint for what is to be done, actually a business model as opposed to an economic model. But I think economic models business models are actually pointless without an economic model. And we did get fairly far to articulating several types of economic models, some for-profit and for the for-profit sector and some not-for-profit. So the three things that I want to say as the final recommendations, which I think are most important for this community, are, and they're just three, and they're not easy, is first and foremost to articulate a compelling value proposition for preservation. I said first that in the beginning that people really do care about preservation. They just don't call it preservation. They call it access. I think that particularly in the preservation field, if you really want to get more resources and the right kind of resources for work, start talking about the outcomes of preservation. Start talking about the things that you can do with preserved assets, or however you want to call them. In the scientific world, they can talk about the promise of future productivity of science. How do we talk about that in the library? How do we actually talk about the future productivity of our students and our faculty? Well, we talk about it actually all the time, that without the collections, research and teaching is really engendered. So talk first about what the outcomes of preservation are going to be, and then talk about what it takes to get there from here. And the value proposition of saving astronomical data is going to be different from saving feature films, for example. But every audience has its own sort of sweet spot in terms of what it really wants to pay attention to. But I think I would start first with what is the benefit of preservation? That's the recognition of benefit on the part of stakeholders. The second thing is to provide clear incentives to preserve in the public interest. What does that mean to provide incentives and clear incentives to preserve in the public interest? Well, providing incentives for stakeholders, as we say, anybody who cares about the outcome of preservation, to preserve digital assets directly or to provide preservation services for others, and tailoring those incentives to the prevailing community norms and to information policy regulations and privacy concerns is really what we're talking about. We're talking about both creating incentives, positive things that get people to preserve, and also removing disincentives, of which there are many. To take a fairly simple example, I'll take a bench scientist at Yale University, or a medical scientist at Yale. One incentive that a scientist has to preserve digital data is the possibility of reusing the data if, in fact, they're interested in sharing the data. A much stronger incentive would be if his grant depended upon digital curation. If the grant actually stipulated that the data had to be managed and archived, and that digital curation was part of the grant and there was money in the grant for it, and there would be a penalty to be paid if curation didn't happen. Now that's really an incentive. It's one thing for NSF to say, everybody needs to save their data and curate their data. But that's not enough, because I can't think of we actually asked people at the foundation and they said, well, privately, they didn't know of any particular grant which had been denied a PI because they hadn't saved data from a previous grant. They give them a hard time maybe, but they didn't actually deny research funds. Research funds is what researchers care about. So holding back money would be very important. A big advance is that NSF is now saying that people have to have a data management plan. That's very good. Nobody knows what a data management plan is yet, but I see this as an opportunity for libraries, frankly. I mean, how many of you have gone over to science laboratories and say, hey, you've got a data management plan you're worried about? Maybe I can help you. This is really an opportunity to begin data curation where it counts, which is at the bench. I'd also say that there are positive disincentives for scientists to curate data. And what are they? Well, because every second, every penny that's not spent on research is really a demerit in his portfolio. Because there is no reward in his reward system or her reward system for curating and preserving data. It's just time away from something that is rewarded. So I think the incentives are really out of skew within the university itself. That on the one hand, you reward people for creating data. On the other hand, there's a positive disincentive for people preserving data. And somehow they think that somehow things are going to end up in the library, sort of magically packaged and ready for you to take care of and serve up again. This is a fundamental misunderstanding. Data curation really begins with the creator, and it should be in partnership with librarians, preservationists, data scientists, informatics specialists, whatever you want to call them. Every discipline will have a different name, but it's a partnership that begins at the very beginning. I think that, that libraries have, well, I should say universities have a second opportunity as well as a responsibility, and that is you have thousands of students coming through here every year. You teach them literacy in many ways, media literacy, reading literacy, mathematical literacy. Digital literacy is what is needed now because our students are digital. They've grown up digital. They know how to use machines fluently, many times better than we do, we think, we fear. But that doesn't mean that they're literate necessarily, and they know how to use information well. There's a chance that, and as well as an obligation, that we can take the current generation of sort of Web 2.0ers, sort of read-write culture of technology, and turn it into a read-write, curate, and preserve culture. I think that everybody who goes through an undergraduate program at any good university, college, or actually it should start in high school, people should be taught how to manage their own data while they're creating it. Not just how to create a paper or a project that gets an A and it be judged only on the intellectual merit, but just as much as you would give a demerit for plagiarism, for example, or worse than a demerit, not taking care of data properly, file naming formats and things like that, is something that people need to learn essentially from the cradle, because it's not something that they're going to intuit until it's too late. So finally, let me just end with a few exhortations to people, particularly in the library and particularly in preservation. I think that first I want to emphasize again how crucial selection is. I think that archivists have a unique perspective on dealing with abundance and sorting through what's important to document, what's important to say, what's important to sample. And I think audiovisual archivists are particularly adept at this. I think we have a lot to learn from them. I also think that preservation is, and I know this will sound somewhat bold and even counterintuitive in these budgetary times, but I really do believe passionately that preservation is emerging as a keystone of the university and its social worth. I really think in this time when universities feel besieged by so much and their whole social mission is under question from many sectors, they can claim, rightly so, that they contribute to knowledge, that they really contribute to the knowledge economy. But so do a lot of other sectors. A lot of private sectors contribute to knowledge as well. The one thing that the private sector will never do, and this was demonstrated roundly by our economists, is they will never care about preservation. They will never ensure the continuity of information from one generation to another. It is impossible for market forces to actually take care of that. And so I think that of all the things that libraries do on university campuses, I have heard people on universities' administration speculating how all of them could go away. Many of the things we love most about libraries can very well be imagined as being superseded by commercial services, frankly. Search, for example, access, for example. But no one believes that anybody but a university is going to preserve. And so I think it means that this is really the golden age of preservation. That if the university can really configure a lot of its information culture around the creation and curation of data, that the library really stands to benefit enormously. It means a lot of changes in the profession of preservation. It means working with a lot of different skills and developing different skill sets than we have before. But I really believe that it really is the beginning of a marvelous age for preservation. Preservation, the paradigm preservation for the digital world is not about fixity. It's about incremental responsibilities. You can think long term, but really incrementally. The key is to think about handoffs, secure handoffs, making sure that data is well curated and making sure that it is handed off to somebody who can curate it and steward it in the next step. I think you have a lot of skills on campus that are very good at this. I think there are many people at the Beinecke who know precisely how to identify really important content creators and collectors of content, how to develop relationships with them, and how to ensure that their collection of information comes to the Beinecke when they are ready to move it to a stewardship organization. Take that paradigm, move it online, go to digital creators, and I think you have exactly the same thing going on. You know, what is it that makes this obligation for preservation so important? I think it's important for us, not just as individuals and as families and as researchers at universities, but I think it is really vital for us as a species, as Homo sapiens. And I mean that quite literally. We differ from our fellow species in many ways, but scientists are telling us every day we differ a lot less from our fellow species than we think. But there's one thing incontestably we differ from all other species with, and that is the ability to create artificial memory, to actually embody knowledge in external forms that we then can pass on across time, across space, and across multiple generations. We are the only species that does that, and we do it through preservation. So I thank you very much. As you can tell, I think this is the beginning of a very exciting time for preservation, and I know that I have given a lot of information, not nearly as much as I would have liked to, of course, but I would commend to you the 2 reports of the task force, and I would simply, I'd say just Google Sustainable Economics Digital Planet. That's a lot easier than trying to find this, the URL, and the reports are actually on the San Diego Supercomputer site. And I also want to recommend to you the Library of Congress has just published its 10-year review of its NDIP program. And it's now online, digitalpreservation.gov, www.digitalpreservation.gov. And there's a full discussion about the many different models of shared stewardship there that I commend to you. They're very frank discussions of the various efforts that were tried. Some failed, but in the end succeeded.